If you want to clip it onto your tie, or you can clip it on to be like the shirt. So if you, it's a little switch right on the side.
Right, I know. I probably used it before too.
It's right on top of it.
Oh, it's on top.
Yeah.
I see it. All right, let's see. Oh, I don't want to stand there because... Well, no, then they'll move. Okay, it's probably a little loud. So, okay, it's good. Thank you. Too much book parties. How's that? Does that sound okay?
I think that sounds all right.
All right, because there are going to be a lot of people.
More of the speakers.
There are going to be a lot of people here. Now.
Right now, but I think when it fills up, it should be okay.
Okay. And can we turn that off after they're done introducing me, so it doesn't become a double entendre? Well, then not, because I'm going to stand here. This is an advantage because I don't have to.
And then when it comes to the presentation, you just want to kill all the...
Everything, right.
Okay, that makes it easier.
Everything.
I don't know what switch goes to what.
No, everything.
Okay.
Everything. Yes. All right, let me turn this off.
So everything's all in order for you?
I think so.
Okay. I'm going to be hidden all the way in the back just because that's where I'm out.
Nice, thank you. You have I have a marker which is good, so it dries immediately. And when I tell you, when my first 15, 16 years ago, I went to a stationery store and I tried out a zillion markers because I wanted the one that was going to dry fast. So they wanted me to. Mark?
Oh, the real one. Marilyn's husband.
Oh, sure.
Thank you for supporting me.
Well, it's an honor.
What presents?
front desk, write it out what you want me to say. You can do some other than my name if you want it. Pick them up. You're not,
I have all your other books.
you're not,
See, I'll see if the
you're not,
There was one here today with Simon Phillips.
just for you. Well, I don't know. I mean, I would ask. As you know. Okay, what do you want? Is this for me?
That's unbelievable. Of course they do. Of course they do.
Stephen.
I'm
Hi.
David Levinson.
Hi.
I'm in the library.
Oh, welcome.
So we're recording
Yes,
the talk
yes.
and video, and it's also streaming live. And,
Oh, wow.
So
Live where?
yeah, anybody who wants to watch it.
Oh, good. Well, good.
Yeah, over the
Terrific.
college website.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
/video.
Very good.
So the main thing is that the microphone.
I will be.
Often people in the audience can hear really well, so people will step away from the microphone.
Yeah.
But if you,
Well, I'm going to be. This is just for.
and you've got both.
This is just the introduction, and this is going off. This will be. And I project really well.
Oh, perfect.
Too well.
Okay, we can pick you up. No,
Good.
you're very
So,
good.
thank you very much. Thanks for doing this. Hello.
I just wanted to put a face to the name. I'm Mark Lawton with Lake Forest
Mark.
newspaper.
Oh, of course we spoke a little bit, huh? I hope I didn't like. I'm like a
No,
locomotive.
It's people who don't like to speak that I have.
Yeah.
trouble with.
No,
People
I'm
who
very. And Franz Schultz, my professor, is sitting in the second row. He's the one that I did it for him. He said, "You're going to write a book like that." No.
Here you go.
Thank you. When do you think it'll be covered?
So my best guess is it'll be in our print edition, which comes out on Thursday, October 12th.
Okay.
It'll be on our website probably sometime before that.
Okay. All right.
However, it's up to you.
I understand. And I can help. If you'll let me know, I appreciate it. And then maybe I can get some copies of it too. Do you have my address, or I can write it for you? You have my email. Okay, very good, Mark. And if anything comes up, you want to ask me any more questions, you can tell.
Usually when I sit down to write something, that's what I come up with.
I'm available and never feel you're imposing at any hour of any day. I mean that, because
Well, I probably won't call you at 3 in the morning.
but I'd be awake. I'd be awake. Okay, I'd be awake. Hello.
Please come on in. That is our 3 o'clock bell, so we're going to go ahead and get started, and I want to welcome everyone this afternoon for coming to this very special event, which is one of a number of events today and tomorrow as part of our homecoming in what is the college's 160th anniversary. So it's a special year for us. We've been here a long time, and there's a lot to celebrate, and we're glad you're here to help us do that this afternoon. I also want to give a very special warm welcome to Stephen Salny, our Lake Forest College alumnus from the class of 1977, who is here today celebrating his 40th reunion by sharing a unique and very personal story. As you'll hear, and some of you already know, the story entails how the passions he developed during 4 years as a student here on campus influenced the remarkable body of architectural scholarship and writing that he has completed, including several commissioned articles for Architectural Digest and 4 books on architecture and interior design, starting 15 years ago with the country houses of David Adler. When Salny was a student here on campus, many of his classmates were understandably enthralled by the architectural statements displayed in the city of Chicago's many legendary buildings. Steve, however, fell in love with the classical residential architecture right here in Lake Forest and in many other North Shore communities. He credits Franz Schultz, our Hollander professor of art emeritus, with inspiring and nurturing him then and over the years, as Franz has done for many others as well. During Stephen's senior year, with Franz's encouragement, he proposed and received approval for an independent study in which he conducted and interviewed the enthusiastic owners of more than 17 Adler-designed homes in Lake Forest and other communities on the North Shore. The 4 months Steve spent yielded an exceptional senior project and also whetted the appetite for all things Adler that he has sustained over the past 4 decades. Steve now makes his home in Baltimore, where he manages his family's long-standing real estate business. It's a great pleasure for the college and for me personally to welcome our dear friend Steve Salny back to campus. Please join me in welcoming here this afternoon.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Well, what a great introduction, and I'm happy to say, in addition to keeping in close touch with Franz and the late Rosemary Cowler, who is my creative writing and English professor, Steve and I have developed a very lovely relationship on campus and off campus. And his introduction is quite complete, and I'll add one thing to it, not that he should have known this, but I used to drive around looking at houses when I might have supposed to have been in classes, never Franz's. And the joke was my mother would call me from Boston and she'd say, you know, you're not doing so good in your major econ and you're getting arrested in people's lily pond gardens and I'm tired of bailing you out. Go back to school or I'm going to bring you back to Boston. Well, I had not heard the name of David Adler until February of '77, which was a few months before I graduated. And a classmate of mine was in the Donnelly Library, and I heard her talking about this wonderful architect and who had designed these terrific, fabulous homes in Lake Forest. And I went over to her and I said, Allison, could I see the book? And it was the first book on David Adler that had been written in the late 60s. David Adler died in 1949 suddenly in his sleep. The period of the Great House was over by that point. And David did not seek publicity in his lifetime. He had a gilt-edged roster of clientele who went to him and expressed interest in him designing for them, but he immediately turned the tables and he interviewed his clients. Some he approved and some he didn't. It was about taste. Wealth was a given because to build the David Adler house it cost several people in the millions in the 20s and during the Depression. And he didn't accept everybody as a client. Jane Dick, who was a formidable citizen of Lake Forest, she lived on Woodland Road here. She was the oldest, the longest Adler client to live in her house, 65 years. And Jane and her husband Eddie were friends of David Adler's. David and his wife were at their wedding, and she went up to David during the reception and she said, Eddie and I want you to design a house for us. And she said for 2 years, she and her husband, they collected photographs from magazines and articles, and they put them in a dress box, she said, that would have held several wedding gowns. And she said finally, after about 2 years, she couldn't get the box off the shelf anymore. And she finally said to David, we're ready to show you the clippings. Now, they were very close friends, and she said, I stood in fear that he would reject us as clients. And a few days later, the phone rang, and David said, I know exactly what you want, and I'm going to take you to a farmhouse southwest of Lake Forest, and you'll see in a few minutes that he designed for them a Greek Revival, very charming house on Woodland Road. So when David died in 1949, William McCormick Blair, who was a very close friend of David's, the president of the Art Institute of Chicago, and a very good friend of David's, he wanted to memorialize their friend. And he went around and I'm sure that he raised funds from several of David's clients all throughout Lake Forest. And he hired Richard Pratt, who was a well-known New England author on historic houses, and hired Ezra Stoller, who was one of the foremost photographers of interiors in the country. And they commissioned Richard Pratt to do a book on David Adler. And his feeling was, well, we don't know if anyone will buy it, but at least the clients will have it, and it will become a tribute to our dear friend David, even though he would not have approved of it. Probably didn't approve of me either, but that's all right. Well, that was the book my friend Allison showed me, and I'm thumbing through the book, and I said, oh my gosh, every single house that I had stopped in front of intuitively was by this architect. Never dawned on me in all those years that one architect could do French, Italian, federal, colonial. And it turned out that it just was an epiphany. And I went to Franz and I said, I'd like to do an independent study on David Adler. Will you be my advisor and mentor? I'd taken 1 million classes from him already, and we were very good friends, good relationship. And I wrote every homeowner on the North Shore of Chicago, told them what I was doing. Every client gave me carte blanche with their houses for 3.5 months. The doors would be open for me. Sometimes I was told, come in, stay as long as you want, do whatever you want, and just close the door behind you. I don't think anyone ever called the college to check on my legitimacy. Mr. Blair, Mrs. Armour, the Dicks, 6 of them were original clients. And of course, the new families were as receptive because they love their homes. And I think they recognized the passion, and say no to me would have been very difficult. So anyway, I turned the paper into Franz a few months later, and he told me this had the makings of a book. And I kind of laughed, not disrespectfully, but I said, oh, no, I don't think so. And he said, yes, you're going to write a book on this man someday. Well, fast forward, I wrote some pieces for Architectural Digest. David's sister, Frances Elkins, was as prominent an interior decorator in her field. She was based in Monterey, as her brother was in architecture. They were not a partnership, but they did a lot of work together. And my book after David was on Frances, and you really cannot discuss one without the other. David influenced his sister greatly. She was totally unschooled in the field of design, and they became the it couple, or the it partnership. And what happened was the Adler book, as time went on, became remaindered at the Art Institute for $7.96. And as people, I hate to say on the East Coast, Robert Stern, the great architect, a lot of architects had never heard of David Adler, never saw the work, never knew about him. The value of the book escalated, and I've seen it go for as much as $2,500 a copy. So as people learned about David's work, and people became more enthralled with classical architecture, because there was a period when people would say, oh, well, classical architects, these big mansions, this is what wealthy people built, who cares? We want cutting edge architecture. There became an audience for this type of book. So this is as David Adler, who he hailed from Milwaukee, from a very comfortable family. They were in the clothing business. And his mother and father had emphasized classics, culture. There were trips to Europe. It was just he and his younger sister, Frances. And David ended up going to Lawrenceville and then to Princeton. This was his graduation photograph at Princeton in 1904. And at Princeton, he had demonstrated an interest in architecture when he did a design for the facade of the Charter Club, which was a very prestigious eating club at Princeton. He went off to the Polytechnicum in Munich to study design, architecture. But his real interest was to become a student at the École des Beaux-Arts, which was the foremost school in the world for architecture, art, and design. Very difficult to get in. Richard Morris Hunt, who was a great architect of Newport and other areas, home in Asheville, he was the first American to go there. Well, David failed on his first attempt to get in. He finally was admitted in, I believe, 1906, and he was there for 2 out of the 3 years. The third year, his studies were to be on structure, and he had no interest in structure. He was only interested in design. And he came back to the United States, and he worked for Howard Van Doren Shaw, who was another local great house architect, but of a different design. And at the Shaw office was Henry Dangler, who was a friend of his from Princeton. And the two of them left Shaw's office, and they started their own practice in the early, say, 1911, 1912. David sat for the Illinois license, and there were several questions in the exam about structure and engineering. He wrote in the margin, Jeeves in my office tends to that. Well, naturally, Jeeves was not appropriate and he did not get his license. Well, Henry Dangler had his license, so Henry was able to sign the blueprints, and David, they both designed, but he needed somebody to sign the blueprints. Well, unfortunately, Henry died in 1913 at a very young age, and David had to find someone else who could sign the blueprints. So he found another designer named Robert Work, who was very prominent in the Barrington area, to sign the blueprints. And eventually, I'm looking for the, here it is, excuse me. Eventually, he got a license. The first house that he designed while still in Shaw's office was for his uncle Charles Stonehill. Mr. Stonehill had financed David's living and tuition expenses in Paris. He also financed Frances Elkins when she went into business. And to repay his uncle for his generosity, he designed this Louis XIII Normandy chateau. If you know where North Shore Congregation Israel is on Sheridan Road, that was where the house was. This house was built in 1913. It was owned by his uncle for about 15 years until they lost it during the Depression. But it's based on the Chateau de Balleroy, which was owned by the Forbes family, the tall pitch roof, the pink brick and limestone, the alley of elm trees. It was quite a formidable house, especially being an architect's first house. Sorry. This is the garden terrace. Adler's work was very symmetrical. The left wing on the first floor was the living room. The right was the dining room, and an auspicious terrace that overlooked Lake Michigan with formal French gardens. The view from Lake Michigan, which was quite startling. Soon after doing the first house for Charles Stonehill, Ralph Poole and Marie Poole had 40 acres of property on Green Bay Road in Lake Bluff. Ralph's brother, Abram Poole, was a very good friend of David Adler's from Princeton. And between Poole and Henry Dangler, and of course Adler's, early promise, he was gained entree into very exclusive Lake Forest, Chicago, aristocratic clientele. So Mr. and Mrs. Poole said to David, when you are done designing our house, we want to be in the Loire Valley. And David transported between, he did landscape design, he did interior design, and even if he wasn't the person who was hired to do those things for a house, he had the final say over any artisan or designer who worked in collaboration. So he designed this low-lying French mansard-roofed house based on the Hotel de Biron, the Rodin Museum in Paris. You see the house was a whitewashed tall windows, the mansard roof, and there's another view of it. The coins were out of cement. The baskets are cement baskets of fruit and rococo ornamentation over the windows. This house is 1912, we'll say 1913, 1914. Still standing under intense renovation now by a couple who, thank goodness, they saved the house. This is the front entrance, the entrance foyer. If you go to the Rodin Museum, you will see great similarities, the staircase, the placement of the case, the front hall. This is the oval dining room, which overlooked a field of, overlooked formal gardens and a field of alfalfa and oats. There was a farm on the property, a farmhouse, where the Poole family lived while the main house was being built. On Lake Road, those of you who know Lake Road well, this is one of the famous houses that stand on the lake. Originally, the Pike family, from the teens, they had a house that was designed by another great house architect named Arthur Hoyne. And those of you who know Lake Forest Academy, Arthur Hoyne designed that house for Lolita Armour, and it now is Lake Forest Academy. The house burned on Lake Road, and the Pikes asked David to design an Italian Renaissance villa for them. Well, it's very close to the road, and you enter through an arcaded loggia that created with the wall parallel to Lake Road a palazzo, a courtyard. You could be in Italy when you're sitting in that courtyard. I mean, this is what David could do. He could transport you to anywhere in the world that you wanted to be, as long as he thought it was tasteful and he wanted to do it. There's another view of the courtyard, and what you don't know when you're in the courtyard, and I've been there many times, you don't realize that Lake Road is just steps away. This is the garden view of, it's actually the main elevation. David took inspiration for this elevation from a very famous house that stood in Lake Forest, a much larger house. Harold McCormick and Edith Rockefeller, they owned, if you know Villa Turicum, that was once a private estate owned by the McCormicks and Rockefellers when they married. And they ended up hiring another East Coast great house architect named Charles Platt to design an Italian Renaissance villa with fountains and that went all the way down to the lake, and an elevator that took you down through the bluff, and a pink marble swimming pool. And this is a smaller version of the entrance facade to that house, but David wanted the entrance facade, the more attractive facade, to face the lake. The sunken gardens that you see, the walls were from the foundation of the house that had burned. And so you have, you have statuary of the Four Seasons and the 10 Muses, and you have, these balustraded gardens that step down, and there was a passage down to the lake. This is an aerial view of Mill Road Farm, or the farm as the Lasker family called it. Albert Lasker was the father of modern advertising. He and his wife and family lived on the grounds of Lakeshore Country Club, on the golf course, and after a while he said, you know, I'm too old to be waiting for tea time. I want my own golf course. So although David Adler designed a house that was going to be built for them on the shores of Lake Michigan, they abandoned those plans, and Mr. Lasker assembled about 500 acres in what was called Everett, Illinois. Now it's Westlake Forest. And he told David, I want a main house. This was strictly summer and weekends. I want a house, a Picardy, 17th century Picardy French house with formal gardens, 26 dependent buildings. Clubhouse, guest house, movie theater, potting sheds, 100 acres of formal gardens, 6 miles of clipped hedges. He bussed in 50 and help every day from Highwood on his own bus. There was even a man who brushed the dew off of the lawn with a bamboo pole. You see the golf course. The golf course in 1925-26 cost $1 million. And from the day it was built, Mr. Lasker ordered it torn up and redone. He didn't like it. The central elevation of the house doesn't look like the house is that large, but it's about 32,000 square feet. And the central section really was, other than the front 2 windows on either side of the entrance, was a very large, like 100-foot long entrance foyer. The both dormers, the shutters were battleship gray. The roof was sort of a Ludowici tile in shades of rust and clay. Took several years to design and several years to build. This is the view overlooking the golf course. The awnings were turkey red. Mr. Lasker entertained presidents, captains of industry, and he never had to wait for tea time again. The wing that you see was the living room wing. That overlooks an alley that went south to the pool house, twin pool houses, very large swimming pool and a pavilion where they had a soda fountain and lunches were served every day in the summer. So you didn't see the pool houses from the main house, from the living room. The grade was reduced by 4 levels, but you could look back at the house from the pool area. These are the 2 pool houses. Adjacent to the pavilion that I talked about with the soda fountain was, was the Topiary Garden. Robert Bryden, who was Mr. Lasker's head gardener, asked him for a half an acre of property. And Mr. Lasker said, fine, what do you want to do with it? He said, I want a topiary garden that died out with French kings. So he allowed him to do that. This is one of the alleys going north of the house to the 8-bay car garage with all antique garden statuary. Mr. Lasker had greenhouses where they were trying to authenticate a freeze-proof chrysanthemum, and he also allowed the U.S. Golf Association to use part of his property for experimental, greens. Unfortunately, Mrs. Lasker died soon after they bought the house. Mr. Lasker remarried, and after living at the house for a while, he said, there's going to be a revolution in this country for people who live like I do. I want to be on the outside of the gates and not the inside of the gates. So he gave the entire estate to the University of Chicago, on which he was on the board. They could barely afford to maintain it. It's 480 acres and, it was considered the greatest estate between the East Coast and the West Coast. It was called the American Chantilly. So eventually the University of Chicago subdivided the land. The main house is still standing. Several of the outbuildings are private homes, etc. And if you drive back, to go down Old Mill Road, you can see remnants, you can see the main house. This house was for Charles and Florence Crane, as in Crane Plumbing. And Charles's endeavor was to make America want a better bathroom. And by doing so, it made him a wealthy enough man that he could buy 3,500 acres of property overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, in Ipswich, Massachusetts, because he wanted a home on the East Coast. David Adler had already designed in the teens an Italian Renaissance villa on Jekyll Island, which is now a bed and breakfast. But when it came time to designing the big house, he hired Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge, who were the successors to H.H. Richardson in Boston. He had designed their house, he had designed the Art Institute, and he had designed their house on Lakeshore Drive. So Henry Richardson, Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge designed a 59-room Italianate villa overlooking the Atlantic in Ipswich, Mass. Mrs. Crane, from the moment she stepped in the threshold, said, "I don't like it. It's dark, it's depressing, it's drafty. I want it torn down immediately. And I want David Adler to be hired, which we should have hired him to begin with anyways." So Mr. Crane says to his wife, "Now, darling, okay, I'll give you 10 summer seasons." And of course, this is just a summer house, no big deal. 59 rooms, staff of 40, 3,500 acres, small place. "If you give it 10 summer seasons and you still don't like it, we'll tear it down." Well, of course, it didn't last 10 summer seasons, okay. So down came this house, and Mrs. Crane says, "I want a English Stuart-style house, and I want it to be on the same footprint as the original house." So David took 2 years to design and a year and a half to build. Of course, it took a while to tear the other house down. And this is called Castle Hill. And again, it's very heavily influenced by Christopher Wren, who's a great English architect. The brick is a pink buff brick, which is David wanted to reduce the apparent scale of the house, so the brick it softened this mammoth house. This is the library, or the gallery, which connected the east wing of the house with the west wing of the house. Was 63 feet long. It overlooked the LA to the ocean. And David had the ability, he actually decorated this house with Mrs. Crane. David had the ability to make this very large space feel very, very human. He created 2 pretty much identical sitting areas and 2 fireplaces. In the antique parquet, everything was purchased in Europe, floors, staircases. David would often go to Europe with his clients, and he would travel the countryside with a crowbar and lots of cash to pay for all the accoutrements that he wanted for his houses. And I think he must have bought up Europe, because there's nothing left. The living room, which is on one wing of the house, and of course the windows, my pointer is being difficult. These windows overlook the LA to the ocean. It's all furnished in Queen Anne antiques. The library, which was known for its Grinling and Gibbons carving over the mantle of fruit and fig leaves. What happened was Marshall Field III, who was a client of David Adler's, lived in London, and he went into an antique shop and he saw that this very famous home in England had been torn down, Castleberry Park, and the paneling, which was famous especially for the Grinling Gibbons carving, was for sale. So he wrote David Adler and said, "You have to buy this, you'll use it somewhere." And David at that time was doing the Crane House, so they bought the entire room. Of course, it's larger than what this library was, and they had to retrofit it into this room, and it was exquisite. You can see the room. What happened was Mr. Crane, after pleasing his wife by building this house, he died soon after. And Mrs. Crane eventually decided she didn't want to live here, and she gave the house and the land to the trustees of the reservations of Massachusetts. So the house is open for tour. It gets a great deal of revenue for people that want to rent it out for weddings and parties, and it's been rented out for movies as well. So this is the library. The library also had a bay that projected out to the LA, which is something David added to the original house. This is the dining room on the opposite wing of the house, which balanced the library. Again, David's plans were very symmetrical. Here's another view looking towards the main stair hall. In order for David to make the library and the dining room symmetrical, the library is 7 feet shorter. But in order for the dining room to meet the service pantry, he had to borrow 7 feet from the entrance foyer and extend the dining room 7 feet. Well, because symmetry was so important, he put the colonnades, the columns, exactly where the wall would have been had the room been exactly symmetrical to the library, to recreate the feeling of symmetry. This is the view you're seeing on the left bay is the living room, the right bay, I'm sorry, the left bay is the library, and the right bay is the dining room. Those were, as I said, that's what he added to the footprint of the original house. Now, what he didn't change was the LA to the ocean. This was designed by the Olmsted brothers, who were the foremost landscape designers in the country in Boston, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., and a man named Arthur Shercliffe. And they founded the first landscape school in the country at Harvard. And Arthur Shercliffe, they were both very famous designers. They did this LA. It's 160 feet wide, and it stretches to like a mile and a half away. The ocean is a mile and a half away from the LA. Well, of course, David liked it and said, "We'll keep it." There's the view looking back. And where you see the buttress wall, that was a swimming pool, and there were casinos, pool houses or casinos that were built into the fill, and those stayed. It's on balancing the pool. It's a fabulous home. It was his largest home, his largest undertaking, Castle Hill in Ipswich, Massachusetts. Well, Mr. Blair, being the very good friend that he was of David's, and he and his wife originally had commissioned David to design a more formal house in Lake Forest, and then soon after they purchased in Lake Bluff, they purchased 11 acres from Mrs. Grace Durand, who had a dairy farm called Crabtree Farm on Sheridan Road, and if you drive up Sheridan before Shore Acres, you can see the current owner has built wonderful museums, Stickley museums, and renovated the farm buildings. Mrs. Durand moved there, and Mr. Blair persuaded her to sell 11 acres in the 20s. So he said to David, "My wife and I, we want a house that's 1 room deep. We want it to be very low key. It's atypical of David because it was not a symmetrical house. It was to look like a New England, New Netherlands house, where it looked like it had been added on to over a period of generations as the family grew. And the wonderful thing about this house is that David was able to make the house look that way, but in such perfect harmony. As I say, it was 1 room deep, so they could appreciate they could take advantage of all the breezes coming off Lake Michigan. There was a very impressive service court that you drove past. It was like a colonial village with planting gardens, potting shed, all done in perfect symmetry. You feel like you're in a colonial village. It also, as you'll see shortly, contained an indoor tennis court. The house was a combination, well, the main block, as you see, was hand-split shingles painted white. The same material was used on the roof, but obviously left natural. And rusticated stone, you'll see a close-up of that in a minute. This is a view looking north. You can see the southernmost, the southernmost structure was like a Cape Cod cottage, as if that was built first. And that really houses the guest room, the master suite. And if you look at it, it's all in four unequal divisions, but done in such great taste and harmony. And it was exactly what the Blairs wanted. They wanted a very informal, again, this was a weekend house. They lived there May and June, and when they would come out in the winter, they actually lived in the tennis house. This is a view of the rear of the house, back of the house. You see again the differences of the different sections. The center section is a gambrel-roofed area on the central mass. That holds, you can see there's a living porch with screens that can be converted to glass. On the left-hand side, that's the part of the cottage that faces the lake and part of the master bedroom. And there are similarities in the gable-ended divisions of the house. Now you can see this is a close-up of the entrance to the house, the rusticated stone, the hand-split shingles. What happened was Mr. Blair was very friendly with J. Watson Webb and his wife Electra Havemeyer. They had gone to college together and prep school together. And the Webbs had a very informal colonial house in Old Westbury, Long Island. And the Blairs had admired it. So they took David to Long Island, and then they also had a great collection of Americana folk art. And for those of you who know the Shelburne Museum in Vermont, that was their home before it became a museum, so they went up to Vermont, and it really gave David an idea of what they wanted. So the front door was the entrance to the house. Well, actually, it's not really the entrance to the house. It's really the entrance to an arcaded loggia, again, that he had used with the Pike House that you saw on Lake Road. See, you went through an arcaded loggia overlooking a very beautiful garden that was done by Ellen Shipman, who is a prominent landscape architect from Cornish, New Hampshire. There was a Cornish, New Hampshire artist colony. She was a member, Charles Platt, who I spoke about a few minutes ago, who did Villa Turicum for the Rockefeller McCormicks, was part of that group. And so she came to Lake Bluff and did, designed a colonial garden. And that loggia ended up, going to the front door of the house. Now here is the indoor tennis court. One of the things that David Adler learned from his friends, the Webbs, James W. O'Connor, who was a great house architect in Long Island. He was he was friendly with the W.R. Grace family from Manhasset. And his specialty were, as they say, playhouses. We all remember the movie Sabrina and the tennis court. I mean, this was not just a tennis court. There were bedrooms, there was a lounge. They were houses unto themselves. So Mr. Blair, several years after building the main house, David Adler hired James O'Connor to consult on about building a tennis house. So this building was built, of course, the lofty steel structure glass roof, the topiary wainscoting, and it's still in existence. And it's enveloped in a Georgian style, building. The doors that you see open up to, they open north, and they are trimmed in Georgian segmental arches. This building also is part of the service quadrangle. It opens to it. It's perfectly in line with a gravel forecourt that's in line. It's in line with the service buildings. And as I say, unto itself, it's like if you've been to Sturbridge Village or any place like that, it's not necessarily on that scale, but it's with that historic, overtones and quite impressive. David Adler's, although David Adler had a great respect for contemporary architecture, cutting-edge architecture, he had great admiration for Mies van der Rohe, and Mies van der Rohe had great respect for David Adler. Isabel and William Clow, who were in the plumbing supply business, David had designed for them a very small English Regency house on the corner of Green Bay Road and Deer Path early on in his career. And then the Clows bought a very unusual piece of ground not far on the north side of Green Bay Road and Deer Path, but it was an unusual hillock of property. And Mrs. Clow was very avant-garde. I remember interviewing someone and said she had the first French bob in Lake Forest. So, so she goes off to Sweden with her husband, and she cables back to David, make it Swedish modern, and she sent pictures of what she liked, what she wanted. I was very, very fortunate because David Adler's family, Francis Elkins, David Adler's family, they lived in San Francisco, and I was very close to them. And unbeknownst to me, when I decided to write the book, and I knew the family already, Mrs. Elkins' grandson, nobody knew, but he had all of Uncle David's file cabinets that had never been opened since he died, and his job book with all of his jobs. And when I flew out there to talk to him about writing the book, he puts this book that's decaying and rotting on my lap, and it's the entire job book of David Adler's career. Then he puts photocopies of what's in David Adler's file cabinets that have been in storage since the 50s. Every style that David Adler admired, every drawer was divided into staircases, paneling, flooring, doorknobs, hardware. David, his nephew, who I'm very close to, he had everything packed up and sent to me in Baltimore. Well, Jane and Morris Whedon, who owned this house for many, many years, she kept saying, my house is in Vienna. And what happened was Christian Wood-Doring, who was a curator of the Museum of Applied Arts, was visiting the Art Institute, and Jane had a luncheon for him. And he walked into the house, and he said, your house is in Vienna. So the Whedons, after the lunch, they picked up and they flew back with him to Vienna. And he took them to the Villa Primavesi, which was designed by Joseph Hoffman. It's owned by a labor union. Ron Lauder tried to convert it into his residence when he was the ambassador. It didn't work. So Jane kept saying to me, and I know that she had several conversations with Franz about this, I know there has to be something, and she knew about my files. So it took months to go through these files, months, and it was every photograph that David had clipped out and he glued to tagboard. It was thousands and thousands and thousands of pages. Finally, and I could look through them, and I'd say, that's Jane Dick's staircase, that's so-and-so's front hall, and I would turn it over, and exactly what I said it was would be in David's handwriting. Finally, in the last box that I got to, Jane Whedon was so happy, I got to all these photographs of the Villa Primavesi, especially the tea house, which was surrounded by a wall very similar. They called this house the Elephant Cage. Although it is neoclassical, it has a very contemporary feel. It's the most contemporary feeling house that David Adler built in the late 20s. And what's interesting is the house backs up to, it was a hillock of land. And what David did is he designed the house to be piano nobile, where you walked in off of Ridge Lane into a reception, a hallway with the his and her powder rooms. And then you ascended a very, long, imposing staircase to the top level. And straight ahead was the living room, 25-foot ceilings. As again, Mrs. Clow was very avant-garde. The walls were upholstered in a pale gray silk. She purchased a lot of the furniture in Europe. The lighting that you see were crystal and amethyst plumes. The doors to the right that you see opened up onto the garden. Well, the garden was raised from the main level to equalize it with the main part of the house upstairs. So you can walk out from the living room, from the library, from the master bedroom, and you're above street level. The dining room, she was working with a decorator named Adler, who was an expatriate, and they together did the dining room. The walls were covered in a split straw marquetry done by a great French designer, Adolphe Chanot. The dining room table was pewter. There's also an accompanying screen that she had made in Stockholm. Well, the Stockholm government was so impressed with the table, she allowed it to be on display in Stockholm, and she was told that it was such a beautiful piece of work and such a great example of artistry, they would not allow her to bring it back to the United States. So eventually she got it out. I don't think she took it apart, but eventually you can see it made it to Lake Forest, but it was not easy. Now you see on the left-hand side is the living porch, Greek Revival. On the right-hand side is the master bedroom. The center section is the living room. And the lawn that you see is above street level. So it's level with the main part of the house. And for those of you who know, if you're driving down Green Bay Road going west, you see a wall surrounding the house on Green Bay, Deer Path, Green Bay, and then Ridge Lane. And, you know, there's always a child in me, but David, they built benching, you know, going around the wall, and if you sit on the wall on your knees or stand up, people driving by think you're jumping. And you go, hi, and you're really ground level, but it's Jane Whedon said, go out there and see if cars don't go screech as they drive by. So anyhow. Again, David Adler's clientele, there was always a connection to Chicago. There was only one exception when he did a pair of houses in Fort Worth, Texas. One of his clients was Celia Tobin Clark. She was the heiress to Hibernia Bank. She lived in San Francisco, Pebble Beach, and she had, with her first husband, well, with her ex-husband, they had bought 500 acres of property in Hillsborough, which is south of San Francisco. And she and her husband split. She got the house, she got all the land. She sold they were living in a house closer to the main road, which is the Alameda de las Pulgas in Hillsborough. And Mrs. Clark was very private. She wanted to be left alone, she wanted to live in seclusion. So she said so Arthur Brown, who was a great San Francisco architect, he did all the civic buildings, very prominent, and they were very good friends, and he designed for Mrs. Clark a very imposing, as she would say, or you might say today, it was too pretentious. It was not what she wanted. She wanted something that was quiet. Of course, this house you're looking at became a 35,000 square foot Cotswold Cottage, as she called it. That Life magazine rang the bell one day, and this houseman came back to Mrs. Clark and said, there's a gentleman from Life magazine. He's going to write an article on you. It's going to be entitled Middle America. And she said, they certainly have the wrong house. So Arthur Brown designs this very imposing French chateau that rose 4 floors from the top of Celia's land, which was quite high up overlooking Hillsborough. And she said to him, you know, it's really not what I want something that's very low key. She knew David Adler because David was very prominent in Pebble Beach because of his sister, and she hired David to design her Cotswold Cottage. So off to Europe, Mrs. Clark went with her staff, her children. They rented a house for the summer in London, and this is in the early 20s. And she had already started to custom plant her 500 acres. She imported She imported trees from Italy, oak groves, everything was flown in, planted, bridle paths. She wanted, when this estate was done, she wanted to only see from her bedroom window what she owned. And nothing that she could see from her window could be owned by anybody but her. So, so she and David go off to Europe with the family. And David says, I'm going to introduce you, she says, well, we need some help decorating this house. So David said, well, I'm going to introduce you to this woman who's starting out in interior design. Her name is Sari Mom. Well, Sari Mom was one of the greatest English decorators, and David brought her to this country. She did work in Lake Forest. He ran a shop of hers on Michigan Avenue. So they went off to Europe, and they went all over Europe, and they bought flooring and paneling and staircases and, as I said, everything that you could buy. And of course, half of it was stored away. I mean, they used what they could use. So you drove up this very, very long driveway past her thoroughbred stables, her guest house, her maid's house, her servant's house, her garage that held 16 cars. And you drove up a very long, and the thoroughbred horses would be on the lawn with the paddock fences, and you drove up this very long, winding driveway until you appeared in this courtyard with this really very unpretentious 1.5-story facade. You entered the house on the 2nd floor. And so she wanted her, and the opposite the front door was a sunken outdoor tennis court, formal gardens. You entered the main hallway. These hallways led to the staircase that descended into the canyon that David had sited the house in. David was brilliant at siting. And on this level were the bedrooms, but they were, you didn't know that there are doors that went into the bedroom areas. Except Mrs. Clark, this was Mrs. Clark's bedroom. Billy Baldwin, the great decorator, called this the most elegant treehouse in the world. The walls were covered in a Swedish linen that had been stenciled a very, very pale green. They were on stretchers so as to preserve them. The carpet that you see was by Marion Dorn, who was a very famous textile designer and did quite a bit of work in Lake Forest with Francis Elkins. And unfortunately, as time went on, part of Mrs. Clark's property was condemned for a road, for a high school, and her children said, the only advantage to our mother being ill is that she never knew what was going on outside her bedroom window, because in the distance she could look for miles and it was all her property. And the Aragon High School and San Mateo Junior College was encroaching on her property. One of the things Mrs. Clark was she was very music oriented. Her family endowed the symphony, a lot of musicians. Her daughter Agnes was major in financing Yo-Yo Ma's career when he was 12 years old. She wanted a music room where she could entertain anywhere from 200 to 300 people comfortably at one of her dinner parties. And she would have the great quartets of Europe, the Budapest String Quartet. She would fly them in and they would entertain for her guests. And they would have dinner and then they would sit in this music room, which was about 100 by 50, 55. And there's a great story. Fred Lyon, who is still living, he's in his mid-90s. He was the great photo documentarian who did photographs for Town and Country, Vanity Fair, and he shot all these great houses in California, the Dillingham House in Hawaii. And he went to shoot this house as a young man for Town and Country or whatever. And Mrs. Clark liked him. And they got along well, and Fred says, I didn't care how wealthy she was, how important she was. I was trying to make a living. I was taking my pictures. So Mrs. Clark had one big party a year, dinner of the year for 400 people. It was the most sought after invitation in San Francisco. They said if you weren't invited, you went to Europe. So Fred gets invited to the party. And Fred's not interested. I'm not going to this, I like Mrs. Clark, but I'm not going to this rich lady's party. I'm not going to know anybody there. Well, it turns out he was persuaded to go because a friend of Mrs. Clark said, you don't understand. This invitation is, people are killing to be invited. So Fred says, okay, I'll go. I'll show up late for cocktails. And he said he could barely put gas in his car to get up her driveway, which is a couple of miles long. He drives up, he goes in, has a few drinks, he has dinner, 250 people for dinner. And the houseman or the butler says, would you like seconds? And he said, of course. He didn't realize you're not supposed to say yes. It's only asked out of courtesy. So he said all 250 guests sat in silence while he finished his second piece of fish. Okay. So the dinner's over, and he's sitting in the music room, being Fred. And this woman comes up to him and says, I don't know you. She probably was bored with all the socialites that were there, and she said, I don't know you. I'd like to talk to you. You're very interesting. Who are you, and why are you here? Blah, 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 blah. Fred said, well, I photographed the house. Well, it turned out it was Francis Moffat, who was the society editor for the Chronicle. And the next day, the entire article in the paper was about him and had nothing to do with who was at the party. Okay. So the best part is, Fred, the party's over, and he goes out, and they pull up his balding Oldsmobile convertible, he needed new tires and whatever. And he gets in the car, and the gas tank is on full, but he's drunk. He says, I drive home. Next day, he says, I wake up with an intense hangover, and I get in my car, and I see the tank's on full. The car has been completely detailed, waxed, washed, vacuumed, the upholstery was shiny, and he's like, wait a minute, I may have a hangover, but I know. So he calls a friend of his who was at the party, and he says, this is very weird. What happened? She says, oh, Fred, darling, when you go to Celia Tobin Clark's for dinner, number one, there are no gas stations in the neighborhood. This is a long time ago. And while you're at dinner being entertained, her staff is giving all the cars, all the limousines, all the Rolls Royces, gas and washing them and detailing them so when they pull up, they have a detailed car. Now, isn't that how everybody lived? So that was how life was, anyhow. This is the close-up of the Engelman spruce. It was all hand-done locally of the library or the music room. The flooring is antique parquet. That's Mrs. Clark, a portrait by Giovanni Boldini. The lamps you see are by Alberto Giacometti. Francis Elkins brought Giacometti, Jean-Michel Franck, and Coco Chanel to the United States. You could not import Franck or Giacometti into U.S. without Francis. This is the view from that grew from the ground up. This is where you see, this is the front of the house and the back of the house. It faced the canyons. So you had no idea of the imposing Elizabethan structure that you were going to see, and that was what Mrs. Clark wanted. The center door comes off of the music room. The left wing is the library. And again, she wanted her guests to feel when they drove up, it was just a very quiet, understated house. And as somebody once said to me, well, I remember her daughter's coming out party. Her granddaughter, she said it was a tent for 1,500 people in the courtyard. Well, this is the coup de grace between David and his sister Frances Elkins. Helen Shedd Reed and her late husband, well, before he was late, Chrissy Coates Reed, they had purchased a house on Lake Road that was a sort of a Victorian wood-framed house. It had been owned by the Poole family, the same family that I talked about earlier. And they bought both sides of Lake Road. Obviously, the east side is on the lake, and the west side were the servants' quarters, garage, gardens, what have you. So Mrs. Reed's daughter was an avid tennis player. So they asked David to come out to Lake Forest and design a tennis house with an indoor tennis court. And at this point, David, I guess, had learned all he needed to learn from James O'Connor and did it on his own. I'm sure James O'Connor was not happy, but that's life. And so they built an indoor tennis court. We'll see that in a minute. And then several years later, they decided, well, you know what, the house that they bought needs a lot of work, and they tore it down, and they asked David to design what I consider one of the greatest houses. It's a Pennsylvania Dutch colonial, perfectly symmetrical house. It's dark gray mica stone. When you pull up to the house, Harry Winston should have such gorgeous diamonds. I mean, the sparkle. Helen Reed hired Francis Elkins to do the interiors. Really, they were considered the greatest interiors in the United States. It was Jean-Michel Franck, Jacques Ametti, David Adler. David tempered his sister's work. She did her best work with her brother, and really was given more or less carte blanche in doing this house during a very trying time for America. This is the entrance vestibule. The entrance vestibule lined up with the center alley of the garden across the street. When you open the front door, the light shot across from the living room window that you see overlooking the lake like a laser across Lake Road to the far end of the garden. If you're standing in the garden, you did not realize that Lake Road separated the garden from the house. So this was the entrance vestibule, and on either side, balancing the vet, was the ladies' dressing room, cloakroom. It was all yellow lacquered wainscoting with silver leaf trim, mirrors with indirect lighting. The furniture was made in London. The election molding was Steuben glass. Across the hall was the gentleman's cloakroom, all Jean-Michel Franck and Jacques Ametti. The chairs, everything upholstered in Hermes goatskin. The floor antique parquet. The sconces were outstanding hands that held the globes. They were Jacques Ametti. Over the fireplace is a bas-relief that Jacques Ametti did. This was very, very advanced, and Frances really, she really advanced the careers of these great artisans when they were barely known. I have to say, since my books have come out, because I did do a book on Frances after David Adler, the value of their work has gone way up. And of course, I'm always arguing with Christie's, where's my commission? And a lot of the things have sold. This is the gallery that connected the north wing with the south wing. The north wing contained the dining room, the library, the arched entrance that you see goes into the living room overlooking Lake Michigan. The staircase was wrought glass spindles. The black Belgian marble columns. This was David's greatest staircase. The living room, which was very traditional, English antiques, Carabao tapestry rugs, which Frances said, well, you know, I want to bleach them. Well, of course, Mrs. Reed said, fine. Of course, it destroyed the value, but it was, absolutely exquisite. And what happened was Architectural Digest commissioned me to write an article on this house in 1980. These interiors were 98% intact from the late 20s when Mrs. Elkins had done them. Mrs. Reed had freshened up a few of the fabrics, but basically it was authentic to the late 20s, which is very unusual for interiors. This is the library, known for its Hermes goatskin walls. They were rectangular panels of goatskin from Hermes that were sewn together with tan stitchery and adhered to the walls. The flooring was antique parquet. The furniture was antique Queen Anne. The sofa was Jean-Michel Franck. The table was Jean-Michel Franck. You walked into this room and it crackled. The great decorator Mark Hampton wrote an article on this house in one of his books, calling it the chicest room in the country. The door casings, the fireplace mantles, David purchased in Europe. You can see the seams probably better on this picture. And it was a mixture of very avant-garde with English antiques. Another view of the library. And I will tell you that you see the books, all the books were covered in parchment covers because, God forbid, it should deplete from the monochromatic, interiors. The dining room, the wallpaper was purchased in Europe. It had to be filled in on the upper panels because it wasn't tall enough for the room. David designed a Chippendale-esque pine, casings and mantle over mantle. The rug is designed by, again, Marion Dorn, who I spoke of earlier, from England. The bay that overlooked, the breakfast bay that overlooked the lake. The ivory guest bedroom, known for its ivory posted tester beds. And the carpet was silk tapestry. The Mrs. Reed's help had to take their shoes off to clean in the room because the rug was so fragile and valuable. The walls are covered in silver tea paper. You can see the patina. Again, Peter Reed, her grandson, who was a classmate of mine, fortunately had the house photographed before it was sold, after his grandmother died like 35 years ago. And there's a portfolio in the Lake Forest Library of all the photographs, this being one of them. You can see the ivory posted tester beds, the Venetian mirror over the fireplace. This is the tennis house across the street. Again, David's brilliance at siting came into play here. He obviously had the experience of doing William Blair's tennis house. And this is a Georgian, they called it the winter house, the winter cottage. It opened up into a lounge. The paneling was designed after a room at the American wing of the museum, at the Metropolitan Museum, the Hewlett Room, which was a very famous room. And he used the same design for the dining room at the Blair House, the projecting pilasters, the cupboard. It's all based on the Hewlett Room. Then this is the living area. The rug was not original. The tables and chairs that you see, it's all Jean-Michel Franck, Giacometti. And if you look at the French doors, keep your eyes on the French doors, out to a spectator's balcony, and the court was sunk 10 feet below into the ravine. Quite spectacular. When Forest Hills would come to play tournaments on Wentzia, Mrs. Reed was very generous and allowed them to practice on her tennis court. This is the Art Deco ladies' changing room. Mr. Reed allowed me to have this room photographed for the book on Francis Elkins. It is pretty much all original to 1927 when these photographs were taken in 2003. The furniture, all the contemporary furniture is Jean-Michel Franck, the stools. The walls are covered in what was called a flexwood veneer. It was a very thin wood on linen, very popular during this era. You can see the trim was an antique mirrored trim that went around the molding and around the detailing. These are pictures taken not long ago. The lounge, the chaise longue, that was the original silk fabric that was put on. Very unusual to have interiors that had not been redone. The curtains were not original. The gentleman's changing room, again, all Jean-Michel Franck. Dressing table, not the chair, but the dressing table, the stools. The Jean-Michel Franck club chair, table, parchment, the lamp, Giacometti or Franck. This is the cover to my book. This brings back a very wonderful experience. I had an appointment with Aleka Armour, and it was February of '77, and she was about to sell the house. She had leased it to Robert Altman for a movie called A Wedding, and I remember going back to the house, and her caretaker, it was in February, we'd had a little snow, and he was at the foot of the driveway, and he was shoveling the snow. His name was Casey, he was a lovely man. And I said, I have an appointment with Mrs. Armour, and he said, drive along, but go straight. And I'm thinking, when do you go straight? How would I get lost? Well, there's a little fork here, a little fork there. In the distance, I see a little dot. And I'm like, that can't be the house. This is a 30-room, 25, 30,000 house. You drove through an alley. Originally, there was an alley of elm trees that formed a tunnel at the end. And you drove through, and the courtyard opened up and embraced you with its twin wings. And it brought you in. So you have a very, federal-style house. Many of the details are based on the Hammond Harwood house in Annapolis. The wing on the left was I believe the guest house. The wing on the right was a schoolroom. Or maybe the wing, I've been to this house a million times. So, the shrubs. If I tell you, I was 6'2". The shrubs towered over me when I was in college. Very symmetrical, overlooking the lake, as you can see. No, I did not hire a helicopter to take this picture, but it's a great view. Marshall Field III, who was now moved from London back to New York with his wife, Evelyn Marshall Field. She was a marshal from from New York. And she and her husband, she and Mr. Field, had designed, with John Russell Pope, he had designed them in a big estate in Lloyd's Neck, New York, Long Island, with a stable area that was as big as most people's houses. Well, they got divorced, and they had built in the city, across from the Frick, a 5-story townhouse in the 20s. She got the townhouse in the divorce. He got the estate in Lloyd's Neck. And with her settlement, she bought 85 acres of land in Muttontown, New York, Syosset, Muttontown. And David had just lost his wife, Catherine. She was they were in a car accident in Europe. And so she said to David, I want to go on a trip. We're going to go down to the Virginia. We're going to go to Stratford Hall and all the great tidewater houses in that part of the country, because I want you to build a new house for me on this property that I bought. So they went on the trip, and it was sort of cathartic for him, having just lost his wife. And he designed for them a house. The front elevation is very much based on Stratford Hall, which is the birthplace of Robert E. Lee. The mansard roof was based on another house, the Shirley House, and the wings were based on, and very similar again to the Armour House that you just saw, except you didn't drive up to the front. You approached the house on the side as opposed to driving through. And it had wings on it, just like the Armour House. Again, it embraced you, very Jeffersonian, like Mount Vernon. And the influence for the double staircase came from Charleston. Obviously, the English basement, the main floor was above ground. One of the cottages, the Winter Cottage, Mrs. Field lived in the city. She eventually sold the townhouse on East 70th Street, moved into, David Adler did an apartment for her triplex at River House, and she would come out in the winter and stay in the Winter Cottage. Frances Elkins did the house for her. The Balancing Cottage was a commercial laundry and rooms for her staff. This is the garden elevation, which was very Doric, based on Thomas Jefferson, a Monticello. It faced a sprawling lawn, swimming pool, and bathhouse. What happened was Mrs. Field decided to scale back her living. She allowed the Duke and Duchess of Windsor to live in this house. They never paid her, and she eventually had to evict them. And she ended up selling the house. The gentleman who bought the house from her ended up tearing down the center section, left the wings, left all the property intact. Then he ended up deciding to take the property, the part of the house that he had torn down, and build another brick house on top of it, which it was just one room. He said, because somebody will buy this someday and they'll have to spend money to tear down the main house. I think he sold the brick, the library paneling, the flooring, for more money than he paid for the house. It was a white elephant. I think he paid $100,000 for this house. in the 50s, and the house had cost in the millions to build, plus furnishing it. Francis Elkins was, somebody once said to me, hiring David and Francis was sort of like a 1-2 kick in the stomach financially. And the house, unfortunately, the property is going to be subdivided. It's now 120 acres. It's going to be subdivided, and the main house, everything is going to be torn down. I've been there a million times, and even though it's sort of in ruin, it is the exact footprint of how it was when Mrs. Field lived. The stables, the greenhouses, and you drive through there, and it takes you back to a time that the 20s, the 30s. It's unbelievable. The trees were imported. She bought an entire nursery, and they had to take all the power lines down between the nursery and her house on Long Island in the middle of the night while people were sleeping to flatbed all these trees into the property. This is just how life was. What can I say? There's the Doric Portico. This is I think this is one of the most famous houses on Woodland. It was Edison and Jane Dick's house. Very charming, very human. The house said after 2 years of worrying that David would not work for them, he said he designed a Greek Revival house for them. Most charming, the off-center front door, which allows for an efficient use of space. The right wing was the garage. The left wing, actually, David sacrificed. Originally, the Dicks did not want to build a second wing until they knew if they were going to have more children or what. So after a while, they ended up building a guest wing that balanced on the west, that balanced the wing on the right. This is looking at the west elevation. You see the Dutch gable on the left and a Greek pediment on the right. David Adler knew how to blend styles, and he did it with grace, and he was the great eclectic. This is the interior of the Dick house. The tables that you see, one was an original, and the other one was designed. It was built by William J. Quigley, who was a great purveyor of custom furniture in Chicago. He had an outlet on Deer Path Road. A lot of the furniture was done for David if he couldn't find a pair. Quigley did a lot of work for the architect Samuel Marks, who was very prominent on the North Shore. This is the detailing of the Greek Revival detailing. Adler's attention to detail was impeccable. Every time I would go to a David Adler house, I would see something different that I had not seen before. The staircase, which was completely freestanding, you see the spindles against the wall stop. And then if you look up, the dome skylight, which is quite exquisite. And here is David many years later. In closing, I would like to read, I can find it. I'd like to read something that to me signifies David and how he was admired. When David Adler died in 1949, high society knew a part of their own lifestyle had also ended. A memorial service was held for him at Chicago's Art Institute Museum in grand Adler tradition. Thousands of pink and rose-colored carnations, his favorite flowers, were flown to Chicago for the service, and a tree from his Libertyville, Illinois farmhouse, which still stands, it's the David Adler Cultural Center, thanks to William McCormick Blair, was uprooted and planted in the Art Institute, placed in the Art Institute. But even the flowers could not quiet the death knell for the lost age. One of Adler's friends, Margaret Day Blake, wrote of the memorial, quote, "Looking back, one can see now what was not realized at the time, because being too absorbed in the death of a friend, it was not farewell to David, but also symbolically an end to a social period. The period when balance and proportion were requisites for gracious living is a memory of the past, except for the few who were privileged to be part of the time." Thank you. will be signing books, and anybody has a question, please approach me, and do not be bashful. I don't believe in it. Thank you.
I want to say hello and goodbye. I'm
How are
leaving in
you
the morning.
doing?
I'm good.
So glad you were here. Thank you.
Where was Mrs. Marshallfield's house in Long Island? You didn't mention
Muttontown.
that.
Muttontown?
You didn't say
Yes,
that.
I also, well, I said Muttontown. Let's sorry. Okay. All right. I'm glad you were here. I'm going to talk to you next week. Like I said, John. Okay, good. I'm glad you're here. Hi, how are you?
very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
You do know that Lasker built his estate because he was